The fork trembled in Greta Müller's hand as she stared at the thick slice of beef on her plate, steam rising from the meat that was cooked to perfection and garnished with real butter that gleamed like gold in the mess hall lighting. April 15, 1945. Fort Des Moines Women's Prison Camp, Iowa. 3 weeks since her capture outside Berlin, and this was the fourth meal that had shattered everything she'd been taught about American savagery and the righteousness of the Reich. "They're trying to poison us," whispered Ingrid Weber, the SS auxiliary officer sitting across from Greta at the long wooden table. "No enemy feeds prisoners like this unless they want something." But even as Ingrid spoke, Greta could see her cutting another piece of the tender steak, her eyes closed as she chewed, her face betraying the same confusion and guilty pleasure that was tearing Greta apart from the inside. For 18 months, Greta had worked in the Reich's propaganda ministry, writing pamphlets about American brutality and the subhuman treatment of German prisoners. She had described Americans as barbaric monsters who starved and tortured captives, who showed no mercy to the soldiers of the superior German race. But now she was the prisoner, and the Americans were serving her food that was better than anything she'd eaten since before the war began. What happened next would force Greta to confront everything she believed about her enemies, her country, and herself, in a transformation that would either destroy her identity completely or teach her that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the lie you've been living your entire life. If stories of moral awakening and the power of human dignity move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what happens when propaganda meets reality and people discover that the truth is often the opposite of everything they've been taught to believe. The journey that brought Greta Müller to an American prison camp had begun 2 years earlier when she answered a recruitment advertisement in the Berlin newspaper calling for educated women to serve the Reich in special administrative capacities that would determine the final victory of the German people. Greta was 24 years old, a university graduate in literature and philosophy, and like millions of other Germans, she believed completely in the righteousness of their cause and the inevitable triumph of German civilization over the barbaric forces that threatened their homeland. Greta's father, Wilhelm Müller, had been a decorated veteran of the First World War who raised his daughter with stories of German honor, sacrifice, and the sacred duty to protect the fatherland from enemies who sought to destroy their way of life. Wilhelm had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, not out of political fanaticism but out of genuine belief that Adolf Hitler represented the best hope for restoring German pride and prosperity after the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. "Remember, Greta," Wilhelm had told his daughter on the day she left for her government position in Berlin, "we are fighting for the survival of everything good and decent in this world. The Americans and their allies want to destroy our culture, enslave our people, and reduce Germany to a wasteland. Every day you serve the Reich, you are protecting future generations of German children from a fate worse than death." Greta's work in the propaganda ministry had involved writing and editing materials that documented alleged American war crimes and the brutal treatment of German prisoners in Allied camps. She had written pamphlets describing how American soldiers starved German captives, forced them to perform dangerous labor without protection, and subjected them to medical experiments that violated every principle of human decency. The information Greta used for her propaganda work came from official reports and testimony that appeared to be thoroughly documented and verified by multiple sources. She had interviewed German soldiers who claimed to have escaped from American prison camps, and their stories of starvation, torture, and deliberate humiliation seemed to confirm everything she had been taught about American barbarism and moral degeneracy. But Greta had never questioned the accuracy of these reports or considered the possibility that the testimony might be fabricated or exaggerated for political purposes. She was a loyal German citizen who trusted her government completely and believed that questioning official information would be both unpatriotic and dangerous in a time of national crisis. Greta's capture had occurred during the final desperate weeks of the war, when she was evacuated from Berlin along with other government personnel as Soviet forces closed in on the German capital. The convoy of vehicles carrying ministry staff had been intercepted by American forces near the Elbe River, and Greta found herself a prisoner of the same enemy she had spent 18 months denouncing as inhuman monsters. The first shock had come during the initial processing at the American field station, where Greta expected to be interrogated under torture and subjected to the kind of brutal treatment that she had described in dozens of propaganda pamphlets. Instead, she was treated with professional courtesy by American soldiers who seemed more concerned with completing paperwork than inflicting punishment on their captives. Greta had been photographed, fingerprinted, and given a medical examination by an American doctor who spoke fluent German and treated her with the same respectful attention he would have given to a civilian patient. When Greta asked the doctor why he was being so careful with her medical care, he had replied simply, "Because you're a human being, and that's how we treat human beings." The second shock came when Greta was transported to Fort Des Moines and saw the living conditions that had been prepared for German prisoners. Instead of the overcrowded, unsanitary barracks that she had described in her propaganda work, the American camp featured clean dormitories with individual beds, adequate heating, and bathroom facilities that were maintained to standards that exceeded those in many German civilian facilities. But it was the food that created the crisis of faith that was now tearing Greta's worldview apart piece by piece. Every meal at Fort Des Moines was a contradiction of everything she had written about American treatment of German prisoners. The Americans were not starving their captives, they were feeding them better than most German civilians had eaten since 1941. The meal that Greta was now struggling to finish included not just the perfectly cooked steak, but also fresh vegetables, real butter, white bread, and whole milk that had not been watered down or adulterated with substitutes. The Americans were providing German prisoners with a diet that was nutritionally superior to what many American civilians were eating due to wartime rationing and shortages. Greta's confusion was compounded by the realization that this generous treatment was not a temporary show designed to impress Red Cross inspectors or foreign observers. The high-quality meals were served 3 times every day, without exception, and the American guards seemed to take genuine pride in ensuring that their prisoners were well fed and properly cared for. The psychological impact of this reality was devastating for someone who had spent 18 months writing about American cruelty and barbarism. Either Greta had been systematically lied to by her own government, or the Americans were conducting some kind of elaborate deception that she could not understand or identify. The breaking point that shattered illusions came on Greta's 10th day at Fort Des Moines, when she witnessed an incident that forced her to confront the fundamental assumptions that had guided her entire adult life. A young German prisoner named Maria Schneider had become seriously ill with pneumonia and required immediate medical attention that would determine whether she lived or died. Greta expected the American medical staff to provide minimal treatment designed to keep Maria alive for interrogation purposes, or possibly to allow her to die as an example of American indifference to German suffering. Instead, she watched American doctors and nurses work around the clock to save Maria's life, using expensive medications and devoting the same level of care they would have provided to an American patient. The American camp doctor, Major Robert Harrison, spoke fluent German and explained his treatment decisions to Maria in detail, ensuring that she understood her condition and the procedures being used to help her recover. Major Harrison had served in Germany before the war and understood German culture well enough to address Maria's fears and concerns with sensitivity and respect. "Why are you helping her?" Greta asked Major Harrison during one of Maria's treatment sessions. "She's your enemy. We've been fighting against you for years." Major Harrison's response would stay with Greta for the rest of her life: "She's not my enemy. She's a sick young woman who needs medical care. That's what doctors do, we help people get better, regardless of what uniform they used to wear or what government they used to serve." The conversation that followed between Greta and Major Harrison became the catalyst for a complete transformation in her understanding of the war, her country, and her own role in the machinery of propaganda that had shaped her worldview for years. "Tell me about the work you did in Berlin," Major Harrison said as they sat in the camp medical facility where Maria was recovering from her pneumonia. "I understand you worked for the government in some kind of administrative capacity." Greta hesitated before answering. She had been trained never to reveal information about government operations to enemy personnel, but Major Harrison's gentle concern for Maria's welfare had created a level of trust that made concealment seem both unnecessary and dishonest. "I worked in the propaganda ministry," Greta admitted. "I wrote materials about American treatment of German prisoners. About how you starved and tortured people who were captured." Major Harrison nodded without judgment or anger. And what did those materials say about how we treated prisoners? Greta found herself recounting the stories she had written about American brutality, starvation rations, forced labor, and deliberate humiliation of German captives. As she spoke, she began to realize how completely her descriptions contradicted everything she had experienced during her own captivity. "Where did you get the information for those stories?" Major Harrison asked. "From official reports. From interviews with German soldiers who had escaped from American camps. From documentation that was provided by the ministry." "Did you ever question whether those reports might be inaccurate?" The question struck Greta like a physical blow. She had never questioned the accuracy of official information because questioning the government was both dangerous and unthinkable for a loyal German citizen. But now, faced with the obvious contradiction between her propaganda work and her lived experience, she was forced to confront the possibility that she had been systematically deceived. "I trusted my government," Greta said quietly. "I believed they would never lie to me about something so important." Major Harrison's expression was sad but not judgmental. "I think you're discovering that governments sometimes lie to their own people, especially during wartime. The question now is what you're going to do with that knowledge." The personal reckoning that changed everything began that evening when Greta sat alone in her dormitory bunk and tried to understand the implications of what she had learned about American treatment of prisoners. If the Americans were not the barbaric monsters she had described in her propaganda work, then what did that say about the accuracy of everything else she had been told about the war? Greta began to examine her own memories and experiences from a new perspective, looking for evidence that might support or contradict the official narrative she had accepted without question for years. She remembered conversations with other government workers who had expressed private doubts about certain policies, but who had never dared to voice their concerns publicly. She remembered propaganda materials that had seemed exaggerated even at the time, but which she had accepted as necessary exaggeration to motivate public support for the war effort. She remembered reports about enemy atrocities that had seemed almost too horrible to believe, but which she had incorporated into her own writing without independent verification. Most painfully, Greta began to remember conversations with her father in which he had expressed increasing concern about certain government policies and military strategies, concerns that she had dismissed as the worries of an old soldier who didn't understand modern warfare and political necessities. The letter that Wilhelm Müller had written to his daughter before her capture had been hidden in her personal belongings and delivered to her by American guards who were distributing personal mail to prisoners. The letter was dated March 15, 1945, just 1 month before Greta's capture, and it revealed that her father had reached conclusions about the war that contradicted everything he had taught her about German righteousness and ultimate victory. "My dear Greta," Wilhelm had written, "I fear that we have been led into a terrible mistake that will cost our country everything we have tried to build and protect. The reports coming from the front lines are not what we have been told, and I believe that much of what we have been taught about our enemies may be false. I pray that you will survive whatever comes next, and that you will have the wisdom to judge for yourself what is true and what is propaganda." Wilhelm's letter went on to describe his growing doubts about Nazi leadership and his fear that Germany was heading toward total defeat and occupation by the Allied forces. But more importantly for Greta, the letter revealed that her father had begun to question the same official narratives that she was now confronting in her own experience as a prisoner. "If anything happens to me," Wilhelm concluded, "remember that the most important thing is not loyalty to any government or political system, but loyalty to truth and human decency. Judge people by their actions, not by what you have been told about them. And never forget that our enemies are also human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The letter had been written just weeks before Wilhelm was killed during the Soviet assault on Berlin, making it his final communication with his daughter and his last attempt to share the wisdom he had gained through years of military service and political disillusionment. Reading her father's letter while sitting in an American prison camp where she was being treated with more kindness and respect than she had shown to her own enemies, Greta experienced a complete emotional and intellectual breakdown that forced her to reconstruct her entire understanding of right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, truth and deception. The transformation that followed was neither quick nor easy. For weeks, Greta struggled with guilt, confusion, and a sense of betrayal that extended beyond her government to include her own complicity in spreading lies about people who were now treating her with genuine compassion and humanity. The support that helped Greta navigate this psychological crisis came from an unexpected source: the other German prisoners who were experiencing their own confrontations with the reality of American treatment versus the propaganda they had been taught to believe. Ingrid Weber, the SS auxiliary officer who had initially suspected American motives, gradually admitted that her own experience contradicted everything she had been taught about enemy brutality. "Either we were all lied to," Ingrid said during one of their evening conversations, "or this is the most elaborate deception in military history." Other prisoners shared similar stories of confusion and gradual awakening to the possibility that their government's narrative about the war had been fundamentally dishonest. Some prisoners remained resistant to changing their beliefs, but many others began to acknowledge that their treatment by Americans suggested a level of humanity and moral commitment that contradicted the propaganda they had accepted as truth. The group discussions that developed among the German prisoners became informal therapy sessions where women who had devoted their lives to serving the Reich struggled to understand how they had been deceived so completely and what their responsibility was for spreading lies about people who were proving themselves to be decent and compassionate. Greta found herself becoming a leader in these discussions, partly because of her background in propaganda work and partly because of her willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about her own role in spreading disinformation. Her experience writing anti-American materials gave her insights into how propaganda worked and why it had been so effective in shaping German public opinion. "We weren't evil people," Greta told the group during one particularly emotional discussion. "We were people who trusted our government and believed that questioning official information would be unpatriotic. But we have to acknowledge that our trust was misplaced and that we became part of a system that spread lies about people who deserved better from us." The education that transformed understanding came through informal classes that Major Harrison organized for prisoners who expressed interest in learning about American history, culture, and political systems. The classes were voluntary and designed to help German prisoners understand the country that had become their temporary home. Greta attended every class, partly out of intellectual curiosity and partly out of a desire to understand how American society had produced people who could treat their enemies with such consistent humanity and respect. The classes covered American constitutional principles, the history of democratic institutions, and the cultural values that emphasized individual rights and human dignity. But the most powerful education came through daily interactions with American guards, medical staff, and administrators who demonstrated through their actions the principles they claimed to believe. Greta watched American personnel go out of their way to accommodate prisoners' religious practices, provide recreational activities, and ensure that medical care was available to anyone who needed it. The contrast between this reality and the propaganda Greta had written about American barbarism became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The Americans were not perfect. Some guards were more considerate than others, and bureaucratic inefficiencies sometimes created frustrations, but the overall pattern of treatment was consistently humane and often generous. More importantly, Greta began to understand that the humane treatment was not a calculated strategy designed to extract information or cooperation from prisoners. The Americans seemed to believe genuinely that treating prisoners well was simply the right thing to do, regardless of whether it provided any tactical or strategic advantage. This realization forced Greta to confront the fundamental difference between a system based on ideology and a system based on principles that existed independently of political convenience or military necessity. The letter that changed everything was one that Greta wrote to the American authorities requesting permission to make a formal statement about her propaganda work and its relationship to the reality of American prisoner treatment. The letter was delivered to Major Harrison, who arranged for Greta to meet with military intelligence officers who were documenting German propaganda operations for historical and legal purposes. The interview that resulted from Greta's request became a detailed confession of her role in spreading anti-American propaganda, but more importantly, it became a testament to the power of direct experience to overcome even the most sophisticated forms of political indoctrination. "I want to acknowledge that I wrote materials that portrayed Americans as cruel and inhumane people who tortured prisoners and showed no respect for human dignity," Greta told the American intelligence officers. "I want to state clearly that everything I wrote was false, and that my treatment as a prisoner has shown me that Americans are people of principle who treat their enemies better than my own government treated its friends. Greta's statement was recorded and transcribed, becoming part of the historical record of German propaganda operations and the psychological impact of American prisoner treatment policies. But for Greta personally, the statement represented a complete repudiation of her previous life and a commitment to building a new identity based on truth rather than ideology. The intelligence officers who interviewed Greta were impressed by her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and her insights into how propaganda had shaped German public opinion. They arranged for her to participate in additional interviews that would help American authorities understand how to counter similar propaganda in future conflicts. But the most significant outcome of Greta's transformation was her decision to dedicate her remaining time as a prisoner to helping other German women understand the reality of their situation and the implications of what they had learned about American character and values. The teaching that redeemed the past began when Greta volunteered to help Major Harrison with his voluntary education classes for German prisoners. Greta's background in literature and her experience with propaganda made her uniquely qualified to help other prisoners understand how their previous beliefs had been shaped by deliberate manipulation rather than factual information. Greta's teaching focused on helping prisoners develop critical thinking skills that would allow them to evaluate information independently rather than accepting official narratives without question. She taught classes on media literacy, logical reasoning, and the techniques that propagandists use to manipulate public opinion through emotional appeals and selective presentation of facts. But Greta's most important contribution was her willingness to serve as a living example of how people could change their fundamental beliefs when presented with contradictory evidence. Her transformation from propaganda writer to truth-teller demonstrated that intellectual honesty and moral courage were possible even for people who had been deeply involved in systems of deception. The impact of Greta's teaching extended beyond the immediate group of prisoners at Fort Des Moines. Her story was documented by American authorities and used as a case study in post-war reconstruction efforts designed to help German civilians understand how they had been deceived by Nazi propaganda and how democratic institutions could provide better protection for human rights and individual dignity. Greta's experience also influenced American policies regarding prisoner treatment in subsequent conflicts. Her testimony about the psychological impact of humane treatment became part of the evidence that treating prisoners well was not just morally correct but also strategically effective in undermining enemy propaganda and promoting post-conflict reconciliation. The return to Germany that completed the circle came in late 1946, when Greta was repatriated along with other German prisoners who had completed their sentences and been cleared for return to civilian life. Germany was a destroyed country under Allied occupation, struggling to rebuild its institutions and rediscover its identity after the collapse of the Nazi regime. Greta found herself in a unique position as someone who had experienced both the propaganda system that had deceived millions of Germans and the reality of American values and character that contradicted everything the propaganda had claimed. She became involved in reconstruction efforts that focused on education and media reform designed to prevent future manipulation of German public opinion. Working with American occupation authorities and German democratic leaders, Greta helped develop curricula for schools and universities that emphasized critical thinking, media literacy, and respect for human rights regardless of nationality or political affiliation. Her experience as both a propagandist and a prisoner gave her credibility with Germans who were struggling to understand how they had been so completely deceived. Greta's work in post-war Germany focused particularly on helping women who had served in various capacities for the Nazi regime understand their responsibility for the system's crimes while also recognizing their potential for contributing to a better future based on democratic principles and respect for human dignity. The educational programs that Greta helped develop became models for similar efforts in other countries recovering from authoritarian rule. Her story demonstrated that people who had been deeply involved in propaganda systems could become effective advocates for truth and democracy when given the opportunity to confront the reality of their previous beliefs. Perhaps most importantly, Greta's transformation illustrated the power of treating enemies with humanity and respect as a means of undermining the ideological foundations that made conflict possible in the first place. The legacy that outlasted the war extended far beyond Greta's individual transformation to influence American policies and international understanding of prisoner treatment, propaganda warfare, and post-conflict reconciliation. Greta's documented experience became part of the evidence that shaped the Geneva Conventions and international law regarding the treatment of prisoners and civilians during armed conflict. Greta's story was studied by military leaders, policymakers, and academics who were interested in understanding how humane treatment of enemies could serve both moral and strategic purposes. Her transformation from propagandist to advocate for truth became a case study in the power of direct experience to overcome ideological indoctrination. The psychological principles that Greta's experience illustrated influenced American approaches to conflict resolution and democracy promotion in subsequent decades. The recognition that treating opponents with dignity and respect could be more effective than punishment or humiliation became an important element of American foreign policy and military doctrine. Greta's personal story also became part of the broader narrative of German recovery and redemption after World War II. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and dedicate her life to promoting truth and human dignity represented the kind of moral courage that made reconciliation between former enemies possible. In her later life, Greta wrote memoirs and gave lectures about her experience as both a Nazi propagandist and an American prisoner. Her story became required reading in courses on propaganda, media literacy, and international relations at universities around the world. The enduring power of truth over deception that Greta's story represents continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about media manipulation, political propaganda, and the importance of direct human contact in overcoming prejudice and hatred between different groups and nations. So here's the question Greta's story poses: what beliefs do you hold that have never been tested by direct experience with the people or situations you think you understand? How might your assumptions change if you found yourself being treated with unexpected kindness by someone you had been taught to consider an enemy? And what would it take for you to have the courage to acknowledge that some of your most fundamental beliefs might be wrong? Greta Müller proved that the most powerful weapon against propaganda is not counter-propaganda but the simple act of treating people with dignity and respect, allowing them to discover through their own experience that the truth is often the opposite of what they have been taught to believe.